Hello, my name is Shannon White, and I am the pastor at Wilton Presbyterian Church. I'm an ordained Presbyterian clergywoman. Today, I am delighted to have in conversation of Voices of Mental Health, the Reverend Dr. Teralyn Curry Avery. Teralyn is a colleague of mine and a friend, and I am actually also doing some work, learning from her through anti-racism work. She is pastor at Martin Luther King Jr. Community Presbyterian Church in Springfield, Massachusetts. She's a TEDx speaker. She's quite accomplished, actually. She is the creator of Pastology, which is a cutting edge field that she'll tell us about. And she has her PhD from Hofstra and an MDiv from Yale. So, Teralyn, I'm delighted to have this conversation with you on race and trauma.
Yes, but Shannon, before we get started,
Yes.
it's so important for me to say I have my bachelor's from Howard University because I want to give props to my HB.
So important, yes. Yes, and Howard is one to really be proud about.
It really is, and especially as we enter this conversation on race and trauma, it's so important to be able to highlight, our esteemed historically Black colleges and universities, because one of the ways in which we perpetuate racism in this country is that we only highlight those schools that we consider like the top 10 schools, right? And so it's so important for us to understand that African Americans have been educated in predominantly Black colleges and universities where we've done amazing and esteemed things just as well as anyone who goes to, my degree from Yale, per se. So I want to make sure that I give it props. And of course, it's where our vice president comes from as well. So
indeed.
Yes.
And having one of my best friends having gone to Spelman, I understand.
Yes, of course. Yes.
All right, so let's talk some about this. When in my work with you, you introduced me to a new term that I felt was really important to explain to people in this conversation on race and trauma. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. Tell us what that is.
Well, post-traumatic slave syndrome actually is a term that was coined by Dr. Joyce, and I probably will get the last name wrong, DeGruy, D-E-G-R-U-Y. Let me just spell it that way. And I would recommend that people get her book on post-traumatic slave syndrome. And really in her book, she talks about the impact of slavery on people of color, African Americans, so that when we were enslaved, there were things that we learned in terms of how to behave and to think and how we were treated and terrorized that actually carries over multi-generationally. So an example that she gives, and it's one in which I know so well, is that she talks about in her book where there are two parents who are standing in line at the bank, and one parent has a white child and one is an African American woman with a Black child, and how the Black woman holds her child close and says, "Don't move." But the white child is running around, just freely. And one of the things that happens as an African American is we know that the consequences are different for us than they are for white people. And so therefore, some of the syndrome is this belief or this fear that something could happen to you or your child if they are behaving in a certain way. And so one of the things that we were talking about in the class is some of the things that I teach or used to teach my kids when they were little, when they were in a store: don't touch anything, because I don't want anyone to assume that you're stealing something. And I understand that for some people, they believe that that's a perpetuation of racism. And I get that. But as a parent of color, as a Black woman walking in these United States, I have to be able to teach my children things that are going to help them to be safe. So when we talk about post-traumatic slave syndrome, we're talking about ways in which we have learned to socialize ourselves and to engage in a racist society based on what happened during enslavement. I also want to just add that there's racial trauma stress that exists as well. And that's another way of just saying, I believe some of the same things, that in these days, when we witness something like the murder of George Floyd,
Mhm.
and countless of other murders that we've witnessed or even just heard about, then we can actually experience similar symptoms as we do for somebody who's had post-traumatic stress disorder. So I think it's very important for people who are watching this to understand that, yes, as people of color, we are resilient people. But when we watch those films, when we hear about those things over and over and over again, we can find ourselves in a place of depression, anger, deep and profound despair, irritability, headaches, all of these symptoms that are very similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. So I really want to encourage people who are listening, particularly people of color, to understand that when you are experiencing those symptoms, it's important to get help for
Mhm.
those symptoms. We don't need to just cope with them, which is what we've done for a
Right.
very long time. We really need to get the help that is necessary in order for us to really continue to navigate a system of oppression, because it's there and we have to navigate it, right?
Well, and not only that, but you're seeing time and time again uh, evidence of it continuing on. For instance, we hear about the talk
Mhm.
that people, black people have to give their kids,
Yes.
particularly men, but women too, young girls and young men as they're driving, about what to do if they're stopped by police.
Yes.
So, and that's got to have a body reaction, right?
Hmm.
So
Of course it does.
take us through what that, the first time that a parent has to have that conversation and introduce that kind of concept. What does that do to a child to have to hear that? And
And what does it do to even the parent? I mean,
right,
I can remember long before ever having to have the talk with them, it's the little things that you have to decide each and every day, what will I say to my child? At 3 years old, my oldest child came home from daycare. She did not tell me this, but my husband told him another parent shared that in preschool, another child said to her, I can't play with you because you're Black. I was floored at 3. So having to decide, what then do I say to my child so that she doesn't get a complex about the color of her skin? So I decided to say, oh, honey, she probably would have said that even if you had a green dress on and she didn't like it. You see, you have to do some quick thinking to figure out long-term damage,
mm-hmm.
short-term, right now, she's hurting. What do I say to her? That's only one incident of many that occurred to her.
What
So
does
long
that do to a
before,
person's psyche to have to go through all of those levels of processing and keeping all of those balls in the air and having to pivot on a in a
it's,
moment's notice?
it's very stressful.
Yeah.
It's very stressful, and also their physical reactions. Because quite frankly, even as I recount these stories to you right now, I can feel it in my gut because it's an emotional toil. And you have to figure out how you will engage with balancing every act of microaggression and really uh, just blatant aggression. You have to figure out, how will I cope? So what it does is it does increase, for some people, it will increase their depression and their sadness. Other people, it will increase their anger. Again, people start to develop physical symptoms around it. There's a stress that you carry on your body, because actually, as people of color, we carry 25 to 50% more stress than whites do. And that's in our daily life. So you can imagine what life is like for you when you're feeling stressful. But then on top of it, you know that you're Black. So to have that talk with your child, to say, when you are stopped by the police, do what they ask you to do, put your hands on the wheel, don't reach for your glove compartment. when you think about that, you really are even unconsciously saying to your child, when you say the rules are different for you, you're telling them almost that there is something wrong with you. That's not the intent of the message. But if you hear that message over and over again, when I say, don't put your hand on anything in the store, people think that you might be stealing. So, what I have to do then as a parent, in order for them to keep their mental health, in order for them to feel good about themselves, is I also have to tell them the counter stories of
Mhm.
who they are and what a proud people that they come from and how resilient we are. But just because we're resilient does not mean that we don't experience pain or stress or any of that,
Yeah.
right? Because this is
So,
actually a really deep conversation, even emotionally and
oh, of course.
physically. Doctors treat us differently when we go in to complain because they don't think we experience pain in the same way as whites do. I mean, it's very complex.
And do you find that doctors get it?
Oh, no, doctors don't get it
Okay.
because I had an incident during the summer where I went out to a protest. And it was not my intentions to go out to this protest, but my daughters were going, and I was not going to let my daughters go out without me. Well, I guess initially I was, but I was so happy that I finished church and was able to go. This was during COVID, of course, and my doctor yelled at me for going out there. And I said to her, I have experienced two pandemics, the one of racism, which I've experienced all my life, and COVID. And when I tried to explain to her, because she said, you should know better, your daughters shouldn't convince you to go out there, because I told her that they had convinced me. But then when I went back to have the conversation and tried to explain to her, it wasn't just about my daughters convincing me. This is my life. She didn't get it. She's like, I
Uh,
don't get into all of that politics. Now,
uh,
this is a person who has been my doctor probably for a good 15 or more years. But that just shows that she actually did not understand my life. And if
and
you
how,
don't
yeah,
understand my life, how can you treat me? Because I am not treated in the same way as you would be.
right.
Right? If I, for instance, have high blood pressure and you have high blood pressure, it could come from two different things. People always
Mhm.
assume that, African Americans have high blood pressure because of what they eat. No, African Americans have a lot of stress that they deal with. And so it's very important to understand that when we go in for medical procedures, there's an extra amount of anxiety that happens with us. And all of these things impact you when you're going in for surgery, when you're going in for treatment, even when you talk about being stopped by the police.
Mhm.
Now, I understand that many people might be a little afraid when they're stopped by the police, but when a Black person in particular is stopped by the police, there's a heightened sense of, am I going to live through this?
Yeah.
And so, if you think about that, this heightened sense of, am I going to live through this? That might cause some nervousness and some
Mhm.
responses that people are saying, what are you doing? But think about what we do when we get anxious. So if their sense, their emotions are heightened, and then the police officer comes with this heightened emotion already because of their implicit bias of, this is a Black person, they're dangerous. Those two things don't mix well together, and we see what happens.
So tell me how or if Black Lives Matter, the movement, has helped to counteract trauma, or has it?
Well, it's really hard for me to say because I don't know the research of whether it has, but here's what I think that it has done. I think that it has empowered children of color, particularly Black children, to say that my life really does matter. And if you won't fight for me, I will fight for myself. I know that my daughters and I had some very interesting conversations during the summer because we might have been thought about how to handle things two different ways. And I think for young people, it is a message of empowerment. I know who I am and my life matters. I am worthy. and you cannot dictate who I am. But that does not mean that there isn't this unconscious, you know, or unaware, that they aren't unaware of this low level of trauma. I guess is the best way I could say it. I'm trying to find my words here because sometimes it's really hard to understand. But the best thing that I could say is when you have depression, it's kind of like wearing a blanket around you all the time, isn't it? It's always just kind of in the backdrop. Even when you're at your happiest moments, it's like always something back there just kind of tickling your senses. There isn't a moment that I don't realize that I'm a Black person. So if I'm moving through society, like today, I was moving through, driving my car, and I passed these police officers who were at a construction site, and I don't think I was driving, fast, but I don't know. And I was mindful of the car that I was driving just in that instance and passing those police officers. I mean, it's very subtle. And then I thought about the fact that, oh, I have a short haircut. So if they saw me, they don't know man, woman, who it is. And it was a split second, Shannon, but I still went through that process of thinking about that.
You have just gone through something in your church. Your church was burned by an arsonist. They're still determining whether or not it was a hate crime, but we know better. Tell us how you and your congregation have responded, and what has that done in their psyches and in yours?
Yeah, so there's always a balance for me in particular as the leader. And that is always extending the love of Christ, which I wholeheartedly believe. And so first and foremost, I pray for the soul of the person who burned the church down. And I think about how wounded that person must be in order to instill such hatred, such rage. And so from that perspective, I think about the individual, because I believe that in the end, something powerful will come out of this, even for that individual. My prayer is to see a turnaround. But in terms of what it does to the awareness around who you are as a Black person, is that you just say to yourself, boy, things don't change. At the end of the day, all they see is a Black person. And there's no mistaking that that church was a Black church because it's named Martin Luther King Jr. And so we deal with that perspective. But because we are people who believe in God, that is the thing that has helped so many Black people and people of color get through the day to day. That is why more of us are not institutionalized for, just going off the deep end, because we have used our spirituality and our connection with God to keep us grounded. Does that mean that we don't suffer the pain? Of course we do, but we do not let it define who we are. So when we deal with mental health, if we are together in a group setting and we are going through the mourning process and we're going through the grieving process and the healing process together, it actually helps us to heal better than if we are alone. So I would say to anyone out there who is experiencing some stress as it relates to racism, because it does not have to happen to you individually, it can happen vicariously. I would say find a therapist and also find a community in which you can process this information. There are times, Shannon, that this becomes overwhelming,
I'm sure.
so overwhelming. And there are days that you say, God, I have just had enough. And you look around and you think, what is this craziness all about? And then on top of that, when there are people who still don't get it. People who say, well, I'm not a racist, so that has nothing to do with me. And those things are the most disturbing because those people are not really being a part of the problem. What they're doing is actually continuing to traumatize us even more when they say, I'm not a racist, so I'm not a part of the problem. And all lives matter. Oh my goodness. When people say all lives matter,
It's sick.
what it actually does is it's like this spear that just keeps,
Yeah.
you know, hitting you right there in the heart. Because if all lives matter, we would not see so many people being oppressed, not just killed by the police, but we would not see differences in socioeconomic status. We would not see differences in educational disparities. You know, we would not see, or actually, we would not see differences educationally. We would not see medical disparities and health disparities, all of those things. So I think what people have to understand as it relates to mental health and trauma, even what you might consider a benign statement actually contributes to that person's trauma. So I would invite particularly those who are clergy, who are listening, is to be mindful how they speak, how they talk, how they interact with folks of color, particularly if you have those people in your congregation. Understand that sometimes when you are ministering from the pulpit, the language you use might be slightly different for that person of color. And then to check in with the people of color in your congregation because their experience might be quite different. So if I am sitting in a congregation and all of this stuff is happening to Black people, and I have a white pastor in a predominantly white church, and they aren't addressing any of it, that right there continues to
Yep.
just,
Perpetuate. Yep.
yeah.
Great conversation. I wish we could continue, but you have appointments and we
Yes,
will
I
continue
have
this
a
another
part
time.
two.
So if people want to get in touch with you, if they want to learn from you in your anti-racism work, which you are prolific in, how do they reach you?
They can go to sacredintelligence.com. That's SACRED intelligence with GENCE.com. And I have two courses that I offer there. One is a 6-week course and one is a 3-week course. So I would invite them to join me in the conversation and the deep work to dismantle racism.
And you are quite good, I can tell you that. And she is also a practicing psychologist and a pastor. So, oh my goodness. What a delight to be with you today, my friend and my colleague. And may we have more conversations like this.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Absolutely.